Chapter 2 is called The Self in a Social World. Again, social psychology is looking at the self in society. How do we react to others? How does their behavior, the way we think, the way we feel, how does that intertwine and be affected by others? So we'll look at a few more concepts in this chapter, more specifically of social psychology. A few ideas in social psychology. The spotlight effect. Spotlight effect is seeing ourselves at center stage. We overestimate the extent to which others' attention is aimed at us. We tend to think that others are looking at us and at every detail, and they really aren't. We tend to overestimate how much people are paying attention to us. The illusion of transparency. We think that our emotions, our social blunders and mistakes are much more noticeable than they really are. So not only are people not looking at us as much as we think they are, they also aren't noticing the mistakes we make as much as we think they are. Social surroundings affect our self-awareness. When we're different from those around us, or when we're in a group of people that's different in some way, we tend to be more self-conscious of ourselves, more self-conscious of the way we look or talk or feel. I'm sure you've all had that experience. Some more ideas. Our self-interest colors our social judgment. In other words, when things go wrong, we think, oh, that's someone else's fault. But when things go right, it's because of us. We tend to want to think that we make things go right, but we don't want to take responsibility when things go wrong. Self-concern motivates our social behavior. We watch others' behavior and we adjust our actions accordingly. We all know that's true. When we're in a group, we watch other people's behavior, and if we're not sure of what behavior we should have, we adjust according to what other people are doing. Social relationships help define our sense of self. Our sense of self or self-perception, the idea of who we are, can change in different environments. For example, you may act one way at school and a different way when hanging out with friends. So your environment affects your sense of who you are. So let's look further at your sense of self or your self-concept, which is a collection of beliefs about oneself. Self-schemas are the specific beliefs that make up your self-concept. In other words, am I smart? Am I pretty? Am I nice? Those are the self-schemas, those specific ideas about yourself. So how do we develop our self-concept? How do we come to think, I'm smart, I'm nice, I'm pretty? Well, we compare ourselves to other people and consider how we're different. When we perceive someone as smart, it might make us feel dumb. When we perceive someone as mean, it might make us feel nice. So we often compare ourselves to others and determine our behavior and thoughts and feelings based on theirs. We also use other people's judgments. When people think well of us, we think well of ourselves. Unfortunately, the opposite is also true. When people don't think too well of us, we tend to not think too well of ourselves. So we let other people's judgments affect our self-concept. How is our sense of self affected by our culture? There are two types of cultures. One is very individualistic. In other words, the individual's self-concept is more self-contained, more dependent on how they feel internally than others' perception of them, as opposed to a collectivist culture in which we identify more with the group. We're more affected by others. It's a we instead of an I. Just to get a better idea of individualism versus collectivist cultures, I included this chart. I'm not going to read through the whole thing because that would take a while, but individualism is simply the I and collectivism is the we. Individualism, we focus on ourselves. We get our self-esteem, our self-concept more from those we are close to and how we feel internally. Collectivism is we focus more on the we. We focus on how other people think of us, and we base our opinions and our thoughts on the group. Self-knowledge. Let's define self-knowledge. In philosophy, it standardly refers to the knowledge of one's own mental states. That is, of what one is feeling or thinking, or what one believes or desires. In other words, how aware are we of the way we're feeling and thinking? Unfortunately, that knowledge is often wrong. The planning fallacy is the idea that we underestimate how long it will take to complete a task. Predicting our feelings. Studies have shown that people have the greatest difficulty predicting the intensity and duration of their future emotions. We're not very good at predicting our feelings. Self-esteem, let's define that. That's how we value and perceive ourselves. It's based on our opinions and beliefs about ourselves. So what determines self-esteem is different for everyone. For me, it might be my academic performance. If I make an A, my self-esteem goes up. For someone else, it might be their athletic ability. If they win a game, their self-esteem might go up. Self-esteem is a cycle. In other words, increased self-esteem is probably going to lead to success because you feel better. Success also leads to increased self-esteem. So it's kind of an ongoing cycle of success and self-esteem. Our self-esteem is also affected by feedback from others, whether it's positive or negative. And usually if we get positive feedback, then that's going to increase our self-esteem, and obviously negative feedback is going to decrease our self-esteem. Just some interesting quotes from the book. Those with low self-esteem, based on research, are more vulnerable to anxiety, loneliness, and depression. They make less money and are more likely to abuse drugs. They often take a negative view of everything, and they're less satisfied with their relationships. On the other hand, those people with high self-esteem tend to be more likely to savor and sustain good feelings. High self-esteem often fosters initiative and resilience. However, high self-esteem can be a problem if it turns into narcissism, which is having an inflated sense of self. Narcissists often think they are better than others, and as we know, that can be a problem when living in our society. Let's look at self-efficacy as opposed to self-esteem. Self-efficacy is an individual's belief in their capacity to act in the ways necessary to reach specific goals. In other words, it's my belief about whether I can reach my goals, whether I can do the things I need to do to reach my goals. And research has shown that children and adults with strong feelings of self-efficacy, in other words, they have strong feelings that they can reach their goals, are more persistent, less anxious, and less depressed. They also live healthier lives and are more academically successful. The self-serving bias, we pretty much discussed this earlier, I think in the first slide. It describes when we attribute positive events and successes to our own character or actions, but blame negative results on external factors unrelated to our character. In other words, we like to think that anything positive we did on our own, but we like to think that anything negative we've done was caused by others. That just, from research, seems to be human nature. False consensus and uniqueness. We enhance our self-images by overestimating or underestimating how much others think and act as we do. On matters of opinion, we find support for our positions by overestimating how much others agree. This is the false consensus effect. We overestimate how much we think other people agree with us in order to confirm our own opinions. When we fail at a task, we overestimate how common this occurrence is. In other words, we think, oh, well, everyone fails at this task. This is so common to fail at this task because that makes us feel better about failing. The false uniqueness effect occurs when we underestimate others. We serve our self-image by seeing our talents and moral behaviors as relatively unusual. Self-handicapping involves engaging in behaviors that sabotage your chances of success. Researchers have found that we often hurt our chances or sabotage our chances of success to avoid taking responsibility for our failures. Self-handicapping is, for example, if I'm working on a project and I'm very fearful that I'm going to fail, I just sabotage it in some way because I can't, in order to prevent me from failing at the end, I just go ahead and sabotage the success of it. the idea is that as humans, we're afraid of failure. We don't want to fail. So sometimes we'll sabotage things in order not to fail. Those are, again, in chapter 2, just a few more concepts in social psychology, kind of the way we work, the way humans work as far as their behavior and thoughts and feelings. If you have any comments or questions, again, feel free to reach out.